The Americans. Chapter 23, The New Deal. The New Deal affects many groups. Pedro J. Gonzalez came to this country from Mexico in the early 1920s and later became a United States citizen. As the first Spanish-language disc jockey in Los Angeles, Gonzalez used his radio program to condemn discrimination against Mexicans and Mexican Americans who were often made scapegoats for social and economic problems during the Depression. For his efforts, Gonzalez was arrested, jailed, and deported on trumped-up charges. Later in life, he reflected on his experience. From Pedro J. Gonzalez in the Los Angeles Times. Quote, seeing how badly they treated Mexicans back in the days of my youth, I could have started a rebellion. But now there could be a cultural understanding so that without firing one bullet, we might understand each other. We Mexicans were here before they, the Anglos, were, and we are not, as they still say, undesirables or wetbacks. They say we come for this land and it's not our home. Actually, it's the other way around. Pedro J. Gonzalez became a hero to many Mexican Americans and a symbol to Mexican cultural pride. His life reflected some of the difficulties faced by Mexicans and other minority groups in the United States during the New Deal era. In some ways, the New Deal represented an important opportunity for minorities and women, but what these groups gained was limited. Long-standing patterns of prejudice and discrimination continued to plague them and to prevent their full and equal participation in national life. One of the most notable changes during the New Deal was the naming of several women to important government positions. Frances Perkins became America's first female cabinet member. As Secretary of Labor, she played a major role in creating the Social Security system and supervised labor legislation. President Roosevelt, encouraged by his wife Eleanor and seeking the support of women voters, also appointed 2 female diplomats and a female federal judge. However, women continued to face discrimination in the workplace from male workers who believed that working women took jobs away from men. A Gallup poll taken in 1936 reported that 82% of Americans said that a wife should not work if her husband had a job. Additionally, New Deal laws yielded mixed results. The National Recovery Administration, for example, set wage codes, some of which set lower minimum wages for women. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration and the Civil Works Administration hired far fewer women than men, and the Civilian Conservation Corps hired only men. In spite of these barriers, women continued their movement into the workplace. Although the overall percentage of women working for wages increased only slightly during the 1930s, the percentage of married women in the workplace grew from 11.7% in 1930 to 15.6% in 1940. In short, widespread criticism of working women did not halt the long-term trend of women working outside the home. The 1930s witnessed a growth of activism by African Americans. One notable figure was A. Phillips Randolph, who organized the country's first all-black trade union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. His work and that of others laid the groundwork for what would become the Civil Rights Movement. During the New Deal, Roosevelt appointed more than 100 African Americans to key positions in the government. Mary McLeod Bethune, an educator who dedicated herself to promoting opportunities for young African Americans, was one such appointee. Hired by the president to head the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, Bethune worked to ensure that the NYA hired African American administrators and provided job training and other benefits to minority students. Bethune had also organized a, quote, black cabinet, end quote, of influential African Americans to advise the Roosevelt administration on racial issues. Among these figures were William H. Hastie and Robert C. Weaver, both appointees to Roosevelt's Department of Interior. Never before had so many African Americans had a voice in the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt played a key role in opening doors for African Americans in government. She was also instrumental in bringing about one of the most dramatic cultural events of the period, a performance by the African-American singer Marian Anderson in 1939. When the Daughters of the American Revolution chose not to allow Anderson to perform in their concert hall in Washington, D.C. because of her race, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from the organization. She then arranged for Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. At the concert, Walter White, an official of the NCAA, NAACP, noticed one girl in the crowd, and this is what he had to say. Quote, her hands were particularly noticeable as she thrust them forward and upward, trying desperately to touch the singer. They were hands which, despite their youth, had known only the dreary work of manual labor. Tears streamed down the girl's dark face. Her hat was askew, but in her eyes flamed hope bordering on ecstasy. If Marian Anderson could do it, the girl's eyes seemed to say, then I can too. The president fails to support civil rights. Despite efforts to promote racial equality, Roosevelt was never committed to full civil rights for African Americans. He was afraid of upsetting white Democratic voters in the South, an important segment of his supporters. He refused to approve federal anti-lynching laws and an end to the poll tax, two key goals of the civil rights movement. Further, a number of New Deal agencies clearly discriminated against African Americans, including the NRA, the CCC, and the TVA. These programs gave lower wages to African Americans and favored whites. African Americans recognized the need to fight for their rights and to improve conditions in areas that the New Deal ignored. In 1934, in 1934, they helped organize the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which sought to protect the rights of tenant farmers and sharecroppers, both white and black. In the North, the union created tenants groups and launched campaigns to increase job opportunities. In general, however, African Americans supported the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal, generally seeing them as their best hope for the future. As one man recalled, quote, Roosevelt touched the temper of the black community. You did not look upon him as being white, black, blue, or green. He was President Roosevelt, end quote. Mexican Americans also tended to support the New Deal, even though they received even fewer benefits than African Americans did. Large number of Mexican Americans had come to the United States during the 1920s, settling mainly in the Southwest. Most found work laboring on farms, an occupation that was essentially unprotected by state and federal laws. During the Depression, farm wages fell to as little as 9 cents an hour. Farm workers who tried to unionize often met with violence from employers and government authorities. Although the CCC and the WPA helped some Mexican Americans, these agencies also discriminated against them by disqualifying them from their programs migrant workers who had no permanent address. Native Americans received strong government support from the New Deal. In 1924, Native Americans had received full citizenship by law. In 1933, President Roosevelt appointed John Collier as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier helped create the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This act was an extreme change in government policy. It moved away from assimilation and toward Native American autonomy. It also helped to restore some reservation lands to tribal ownership. The act mandated changes in 3 areas. 1, economic. Native American lands would belong to an entire tribe. This provision strengthened Native American land claims by prohibiting the government from taking over unclaimed reservation lands and selling them to people other than Native Americans. Cultural, number 2. The number of boarding schools for Native American children was reduced, and children could attend school on the reservations. And 3, political. Tribes were given permission to elect tribal councils to govern their reservations. Some Native Americans who valued their tribal traditions hailed the act as an important step forward. Others who had become more, quote, Americanized as individual landowners under the previous Dawes Act objected because they were tired of white people telling them what was good for them. Although New Deal policies had mixed results for minorities, these groups generally backed President Roosevelt. In fact, one of FDR's greatest achievements was to create the New Deal Coalition, an alignment of diverse groups dedicated to supporting the Democratic Party. The coalition included Southern whites, various urban groups, African Americans, and unionized industrial workers. As a result, Democrats dominated national politics throughout the 30s and 40s. As a result of the Wagner Act and other pro-labor legislation passed during the New Deal, union members enjoyed better working conditions and increased bargaining power. In their eyes, President Roosevelt was, quote, a friend of labor, end quote. Labor unions donated money to Roosevelt's re-election campaigns, and union workers pledged their votes to him. Between 1933 and 1941, union membership grew from less than 3 million to more than 10 million. Unionization especially affected coal miners and workers in mass production industries such as the automobile, rubber, and electrical industries. It was in these industries, too, that a struggle for dominance within the labor movements began to develop. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, had traditionally been restricted to the craft unions, such as carpenters and electricians. Most of the AFL leaders opposed industry-wide unions that represented all the workers in a given industry, such as automobile manufacturing. Frustrated by this position, several key labor leaders, including John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers of America and David Dubinsky of the International Ladies Garment Workers, formed the Committee for Industrial Organization to organize industrial unions. The committee rapidly signed up unskilled and semi-skilled workers, and within 2 years it succeeded in gaining union recognition in the steel and automobile industries. In 1938, the Committee for Industrial Organization was expelled from the AFL and changed its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. This split lasted until 1955. One of the main bargaining tactics of the labor movement in the 1930s was the sit-down strike. Instead of walking off their jobs, workers remained inside their plants, but they did not work. This prevented the factory owners from carrying on production with strikebreakers or scabs. Some Americans disapproved of the sit-down strike, calling it a violation of private property. Nonetheless, it proved to be an effective bargaining tool. Not all labor disputes in the 1930s were peaceful. Perhaps the most dramatic incident was the clash at the Republic Steel plant in Chicago on Memorial Day 1937. Police attacked striking steelworkers outside the plant. One striker, an African-American man, recalled this experience. Quote, from Jesse Reese. I began to see people drop. There was a Mexican by my side, and he fell, and there was a black man on my side, and he fell. Down I went. I crawled around in the grass and saw that people were getting beat. I'd never seen police beat women, not white women. I'd seen them beat black women, but this was the first time in my life I'd seen them beat white women with sticks. 10 people were killed and 84 wounded in this incident, which became known as the Memorial Day Massacre. Shortly after, the National Labor Relations Board stepped in and required the head of Republic Steel, Tom Girdler, to negotiate with the union. This and other actions helped labor gain strength during the 1930s. Urban voters were another important component of the New Deal coalition. Support for the Democratic Party surged, especially in large northern cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. These and other cities had powerful city political organizations that provided services such as jobs in exchange for votes. In the 1936 election, President Roosevelt carried the nation's 12 largest cities. Support for President Roosevelt came from various religious and ethnic groups, Roman Catholics, Jews, Italians, Irish, and Polish, and other Slavic peoples, as well as from African Americans. His appeal to these groups was based on the New Deal labor laws and work relief programs which aided the urban poor. The president also made direct and persuasive appeals to urban voters at election time. To reinforce his support, he also appointed many officials of urban immigrant backgrounds, particularly Roman Catholics and Jews, to important government positions. Women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and workers from all walks of life were greatly affected by the New Deal. It also had a tremendous influence on American society and culture.